You're listening to Seminary Dropout, episode 31, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. Welcome, dropouts. Remember, that was your choice to be called that, not mine. All right. Thanks so much for listening today. I've got a great show today with Halee Gray Scott talking about her new book, Dare Mighty Things. But before we get into that, I want to talk about something really important. I usually save this kind of thing for the end of the podcast, but I want to stick it at the first for a reason this time. Usually I talk about two main ways that you can help out the show. And I'm going to save those two main ways for the end of the podcast like I usually do, but I want to talk about a third way that you can help out. This is a way you can help out that will help out exponentially. Most of you, or some of you, probably listen to this podcast through iTunes. That's the way the majority of people listen to podcasts, but not everyone does. The way that a lot of people will discover this is by going into iTunes and they'll look under religion or spirituality, and then they'll go to Christianity and see what's available. If Seminary Dropout makes the ranked list of Christian podcasts, that will greatly increase the exposure of the show. Now, no one knows the algorithm that iTunes uses to rank the podcasts, unfortunately. It's a combination of what most people think. It's a combination of subscriptions, of downloads for the episodes, and for ratings and reviews. Now, Seminary Dropout has, at this point, just under 70 reviews, and all but 3 of those are 5-star reviews. There are tons of podcasts who have many, many more listeners who have been around for a lot longer than Seminary Dropout that don't have near as many reviews, and certainly not near as many 5-star reviews. So what that tells me is that although because the show is still relatively new, we have still a fairly small audience. It's growing every day, but still relatively small. But you guys, you ladies and gentlemen, are extremely involved. You're extremely active for podcast listeners, because for me to have just under 70 5-star reviews and only have the listeners we have speaks volumes for what you do, and I greatly appreciate it. Now, I need help getting that other metric up, which is the subscriptions. And so for those of you who aren't subscribed, and it's not even, I get that it may not even be the way that you listen to the podcast. You listen through Stitcher, or you just go to the blog and press play under the show, or some other way. It will still help for if you go and subscribe. And so for those of you with iPhones, the latest update comes with the native podcast app. And so if you have that, it would greatly help if you press that podcast app, go in there, go to the bottom right-hand corner, hit search Seminary Dropout, and then it'll take you and it'll show you a logo of Seminary Dropout. Click on that logo, it'll take you to the show, and then click on the right-hand side, close to the top, click subscribe, and you'll be subscribed. Like I said, I get it. You may not even listen that way, but again, it'll really help. For those of you who don't have that app, it will help if you actually go to iTunes on your desktop, open up iTunes, search Seminary Dropout in the store, click on Seminary Dropout, and then click subscribe in what will be the left-hand side. It will help out so much if we get these subscriptions up, and then we could possibly make the top 200 Christian podcasts, and they stop ranking after 200. If we make that list, we're going to see the listenership go up dramatically, I think, most likely. So that's going to help. Listen, I'm going to go ahead and thank you in advance because I really, really appreciate it. It helps the show be seen by more and more people, and then the show's just going to keep getting better. I'll go ahead and tell you, and I've mentioned this in the past, my goal is to make this a weekly podcast instead of every other week. I'm pretty close. I'm pretty close. And so, and maybe in a couple of months, we'll be able to go week to week. I can't make any promises. Since it's an interview style format, I can't just knock out several episodes in a day. I'm kind of at the mercy of people who I want to interview. And so I'm working really hard towards that. And I think that will help the podcast greatly. Obviously, we'll have tons more downloads when I'm publishing twice as much. So, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and thank you in advance. Now, let's go to this podcast or this interview. It's a fantastic interview. I'm not going to tease it anymore. Enjoy.
My guest today is Halee Grace Scott. She has a PhD from Talbot School of Theology. She's an author, scholar, and global leadership consultant focusing on leadership development and strategic planning based on original research. She teaches seminary courses in spiritual formation, theology, and leadership in seminaries across the country. Her writings have appeared in Christianity Today, Christian Education Journal, Real Clear Religion, and Relevant. Today I'm here talking with her about her book, Dare Mighty Things, Mapping the Challenges of Leadership for Christian Women. Halee Grace Scott, thanks so much for being on Seminary Dropout today. You know, there's really no shortage of books for women today in the secular field on getting ahead and getting into leadership roles, which they rightly deserve. And lately in the media in the last year or so, the book Lean In by the Facebook CEO comes to mind. Why one for Christian women specifically? Why can't they just apply these secular books and teachings to their lives as well?
You know, as I was writing the book, Lean In actually came out, and I got to watch how. I haven't actually read Lean In yet. I'm looking forward to reading it, but I noticed women started to really talk about, well, I really like the principles of trying to do my job and be a leader in my business, but I don't know how this integrates with my calling or my Christian faith. And I see Dare Mighty Things as showing women how their leadership actually integrates with their calling and comes out of their calling. Because a lot of Christian women, I think, don't have the concept of themselves as leaders. And what I want to do is show them how they're leading and help them to be better leaders and root that in their Christian faith and part of their identity as God's children.
You, in the beginning of the book, you set out some really important things, and you address, first of all, something that's probably unavoidable when writing a book like that, which is the complementarian versus egalitarian debate. And you very nicely in the beginning kind of not pushed it aside, so to speak, but you address it and then you kind of begin to speak above it because you believe that the message of the book is applicable to both complementarians and egalitarians. Is that fair to say?
I do. And that's a really important point because I have degrees from seminaries that lie in both fields. And as I was in school, I noticed my professors and the people that mentored me, men, both complementarians and egalitarians, were very encouraging of me as leaders. And so I grew to understand both camps really, really well and also understand what was being said on each side that the other was kind of afraid of. The complementarians are a little afraid of feminism, the radical kind of feminism that we sometimes see in the secular world. And then the egalitarians are really afraid of abusive patriarchy. And so they're reacting against each other, and those fears are so loud that they can't hear what each other is saying. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to acknowledge those fears on each side and show each side what they had in common and how on this foundation of commonality, how we can actually talk about all of us, how we can help women be better leaders in whatever sphere that they may be leading in. Because even in the most conservative complementarian camps, women are leading very effective ministries. One of the women I spoke with was Mary Bell, who was appointed by John Piper to be the minister to women at his church in Minnesota. And she was one of the most amazing, phenomenally gifted women leaders I've heard of, and she comes from a complementarian camp. And also the same is true for Sue Edwards, who teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary. Very strong women leader, committed throughout her career to developing women leaders. And those stories get swallowed up by the theological debate between egalitarians and complementarians. And whenever we're still arguing about that, we can't move on to actually say, okay, we agree that women can be leaders in some degree, so let's just move forward and learn how we can equip women the best we can for the task that God has for them.
You talk about you are a big part of what you do is research. You talk about how there's a real lack of research about Christian women in leadership, and kind of going back to my first question, there's not a lot of shortage of literature for women in the secular realm and research to go along with it, but not so much within Christianity. Why do you think that is?
Initially, I thought, as I did my dissertation, I thought it was exclusively because of the theological debate. And I thought that all of these people that were graduating seminaries, that were getting the doctorates, that were learning how to do research, were actually not moving past that discussion so that they could actually start talking about, strategic things like how do we help women. But I talked with a advisor of mine at Biola, at Talbot School of Theology, and he's really good at research. And I asked him, I said, why do you think that there's so little research on Christian women leaders? And he said that it is a theological debate, but it's also the fact that very few Christians are actually getting PhDs in empirical research. So what that means is that there are no Christians that are going through Christian schools to get degrees to teach them how to be researchers, to get the credibility and the ability to conduct solid research studies. And he said most Christians are going to do the philosophical dissertation and they don't learn how to do empirical research. So you have very few Christians that are actually doing that, and then you have even fewer women that are doing that because there's so few women in seminary. So by the time you get to people who are actually able to do the research, and you have people that are really interested in asking their own questions, it's not very common to have a woman insert from a conservative seminary doing research. And it's those two things. It's a theological debate, but also it's how few people there are actually doing research. And, if you look at, the studies that come out that we talk about in the media, a lot of them are either Barna or they come out of Lifeway Research Center. And Barna has only recently, started to address women's issues. I mean, he's picked that up in the last year and a half or so to start asking those questions. But before that time, they just weren't, women leaders were not on their radar.
It sounds like you're saying that part of it is kind of a catch-22 because researchers kind of naturally research their own demographic, and because there aren't tons of women in seminary and the leadership roles and things like that, there's less of them to go into the research field, and then it seems like it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle because it's researched less women become interested in it. Yeah, invisible. Exactly. Well, you talk about in the book that there are fewer women in church and fewer going to seminary, which is really sad. And you would think that that's counterintuitive to me. Why do you think that is?
Well, I have a friend that's actually doing research right now investigating why women who are pursuing an MDiv are motivated to do it. And the reason that she's asking that question is because if you do look at the statistics that we do have, the little bit that we do have, there's so few women in the pastorate that she was wondering, if you know that it's such a slim chance that you're actually going to be in ministry, that you're actually going to get a pastoral role, then why are you doing the MDiv? And so I think that the lower amount of women going into seminary has to do with the expectation of what they're called to do, and that can be derived from a lot of things like, just like you said about the self-perpetuating cycle. Women if you don't have someone to look up to, if you don't have a lot of role models, you can't envision yourself. It's very hard for you to trailblaze, in a sense. It's very hard for a whole lot of people to trailblaze. And so it's really important to have those role models ahead of you to say, hey, this is what's possible. This is what God can do through my life. If you don't see a lot of women going into the pastorate, if you see a lot of women become biblical counselors, you're probably going to think, well, I'll become a biblical counselor, because that's what I've seen, that's what I'm going to model my life after. And it's not until you get someone who's, dead certain that they're called to be in the ministry, that they're dead called to be in some kind of pastoral role that actually trailblazes and say, hey, yeah, I know that most women are going into counseling, but I'm going to go and get my MDiv. And it'll be really interesting to see what my friend finds out at, what makes those women different from other women. But yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the self-perpetuating cycle, and that if we don't have a lot of women leaders, if the women leaders that are out there are actually invisible because we're not talking about their stories, then women don't have a good vision of what God can achieve through their lives.
And further to the point that you touched on, some of the research that you talk about in the book and some of your anecdotal evidence points to this reality that women who are coming of age are seeing the writing on the wall, are seeing that, hey, I might work just as hard and harder as my male counterparts and still not be hired by a church, still not be put in charge of a ministry. And so it seemed like you were saying in some ways that women are kind of saying, who needs this? I could just go into a secular field, which is unfortunately sometimes farther ahead than the church is, and maybe not have the frustrations there.
Absolutely. I talked to a lot of women who said that. And in fact, some of the women that, that are really leading huge Christian nonprofits right now, like Lead Like Jesus and the Christian Leadership Alliance, both of the women that are heading those organizations came from the secular field. And I'll just give an example. Phyllis Hendry, who had Lead Like Jesus, she felt called when she was a little girl going on the house visits with her dad, that, God, I know I'm supposed to do this. I know I'm called to be a pastor. I know I'm called to do this. And she would actually line up all of her stuffed animals and start preaching to them. She'd write a sermon and preach to her stuffed animals. And then as she grew older, she started to see, well, wait, I don't see any other women. And then she started to think, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe that's not. And then she decided that she did have leadership gifts, but she had to exercise those outside of the church. So she actually went into a secular job for the majority of her career before coming to Lead Like Jesus. Now she's an elder at her church and everything like that, but this was decades of her being a leadership in the secular world. And it's almost like Christian organizations aren't going to take the time to develop women leaders, but they want a woman leader, so they're going to have to pull them from the secular world who have invested in them. And I think that's what the danger is in not sharing the story of women leaders, is that you're not giving women a vision of how God can work through their life. You're not actually telling women, hey, there are a whole bunch of women that are leading. We're just not telling their stories because they're not on our radar.
Well, it makes me cringe thinking of the decades that the body missed out on that woman's gifting in her ministering and pastoring to the body. Right. You say in the book that the research indicates that more women were being involved in church and church leadership and in seminary and things like that. And then back in, looks like 2001, 2002, that kind of stalled. Do you have any idea what reasons are behind that other than the things that we've already talked about?
Right. The latest years that have been coming out, I was looking at ATS accredited schools, which are really the only gauge we have, a reliable gauge that we have for at least evangelical schools, and that shows a decline. And I'm not exactly sure why that would be the case. I have a few educated guesses, and one of them would be that women are putting, because of the economic times, because of different issues in our culture right now at large, just practically, women may be putting their education on the back burner, their training for seminary, and then there also may be a disenchantment with their prospects after going through seminary. So it could be either one of those, and it's really hard to know for sure.
You talked about, and my favorite chapter of the book is called "The Myth of the Exceptional Woman" or "Exceptional Women." Talk about what is the myth? It's chapter 7. It's Super Women, exposing the myth of the exceptional woman. What is that myth?
Well, the myth of the exceptional woman is that whenever we have so few women leaders that are actually on the public stage, you know, the top women speakers, the top women bloggers, and there's just like a little handful of them, like a little representation of them. And even in the local church, you may have one woman that's leading in some area of ministry or a few women. And rather than being the norm of and gender equally distributed in some way, you have just a select few of women. And that causes what I call the myth of the exceptional woman. It's not that we don't believe any longer that no women can lead. We believe that only certain women can lead, and that only certain exceptional women, these women are different from us in some way. They're better than us. They're smarter than us. They're more gifted than us. And I really take issue with that. In my book, I'm saying no. I don't think that the women that are leading are exceptional in ways that can't be bridged with training or education, because I want every woman to know that they're gifted by God in ways that will put them in leadership roles, in roles of influence. And I want women to know that God can use them for mighty things, and they can do mighty things, and not just think, oh, well, I'm not like Cherie at church. I don't have her giftedness for speaking, or I don't have Anne's organizational skills, so I can't be a leader like her. I want women to say, no, this is not, it's not that they're exceptional. It's in any way that they may have gotten more training or more education, but you can too. They're not just leaders by some giftedness of the Spirit that's not available to you.
And kind of the subtext seems to be that in the category of people who are qualified for leadership are men and exceptional women. Meaning that not all women, but exceptional. You have to be, if you're a man, that's fine, whatever kind of man. If you're a woman, you have to be exceptional. You use the illustration of Corrie ten Boom. What about her busts the myth of the exceptional woman, so to speak?
Well, Corrie ten Boom is an amazing, amazing woman. I didn't read her book until this last year when I was going through the Shoah memoirs of the Holocaust. And I read her book, and I was just amazed by her. But what struck me about her most is before the war, if you would have seen her in her daily life, you wouldn't have thought that God was creating an incredibly mighty leader in her. You would have never guessed it. She was the helper. She actually started, after her mother died, she took care of their home while her sister ran the office. And she did that for a while and realized, I'm not very good at this. And her sister realized, I don't really like this either, working the office. So they switched roles. So she worked in the office of her dad's clock-making shop. There wasn't this great surrounding of all these leadership skills and all this leadership gifts that were shining. She was just an ordinary person. And how many women are out there that have the leadership potential of Corrie ten Boom that haven't been recognized, that people haven't actually seen what God's doing in them, that people aren't recognizing how gifted this person is and how much they can be used by God. And that's the appeal with Corrie ten Boom, and that's really what I learned from her, is that you can never tell who God is working through, and you'll be surprised.
In the same chapter, you talk about kind of the nature of leadership, and that for a small segment of the population, there is some kind of inborn natural talent but too often we, and I think you're making the point specifically, women say, well, I wasn't born with that, so I can't lead. But you really bust that part of the myth as well, because you say that research has indicated that most people, about 2/3 of leaders, are taught leadership, that their leadership abilities come from they're learned, they're not inborn, so to speak.
Right. And, that's a really important point because, I know that even myself, as when I first started seminary, and I write about this in the book about my mentor, Sarah Sumner, and going with her to downtown Los Angeles and listening to her speak for 5 hours with no notes and had everyone in the room engaged. And I thought, wow, goodness, I'm never going to do that. So I might as well just hang my head up now and figure out something else to do. And really, that was just me discrediting what God could do, because maybe Sarah does, and she does have an amazing giftedness to speaking, but just because she's extremely gifted in that way doesn't mean that I should never go speak, because speaking requires all this different kind of gifts and all this different kinds of skills and techniques, and some people have that little extra that makes it absolutely phenomenal. But a lot of people can do something and do a really great job. And so part of it's just accepting, okay, 2/3. I bring 2/3 of leadership to the table, and I can do a really great job. And yeah, thank God for people like Sarah who can do a phenomenal job in this area. That I'll settle for really great too.
It seems like a lot of what you're kind of getting at in this chapter is that we kind of have this tendency to put things linearly and kind of rank things, and so we look at that person kind of like the example you were just giving and say, well, this person is better than me. This is the first best person for this job, and maybe I'm way down on that list. But it seems that God does not do that. God does not say, well, here's my number one leader and talented, but rather that God says, for this place and time, you are the best person that I have for this community, for this church, for this body, for this nonprofit, and that sort of thing.
Right. There's this saying, and I'm going to totally butcher it, but it's how silent would the woods be if only the most talented bird was singing. And the essence of that is we need all the voices. We need all the birds singing, and all the birds singing is a much more beautiful sound than just the one with the best voice or the best pitch or the best, whatever. We need all the birds to make that beautiful sound, and we need all people to be doing their job. I mean, you don't have to look more than 5 minutes into your daily newscast to see how much we need God's people and God's love in the world. And we need people that really, really understand their giftedness and are really not afraid to use it. And I think that there's a lot of fear that comes into play whenever we see someone that's extremely talented in the area that we want to go into. And there's a temptation to hold back. And I think that's rooted in the fear of that you won't be enough, or that I guess the futility almost of saying, well, I'm not as good as them, so I might as well not try.
I should have mentioned this kind of in the beginning, but my next question has to do with kind of the title of the book, and the title "Dare Mighty Things" comes from a speech that Theodore Roosevelt gave. What was so? What is it about that phrase and that speech that to you stood out as such a great metaphor for the message that you wanted to deliver to Christian women?
It came about as it actually developed because the initial, when I wrote my dissertation, I had a title in mind, Brave New Women, spinning off the H.G. Wells or is that Huxley? I don't remember. One of the two, out of Huxley or Wells, but Brave New Women. And when I started the book, I thought of that title. And then as I started to go through these challenges, I thought about how I experience challenges and how I experience failure. And whenever I experience failure, I feel like, wow, that's the final nail in the coffin. That's all she wrote. and I'm really tempted to give up whenever I fail. And I thought about a lot of the women that I've talked to and how they've experienced failure, and a lot of them express the same sentiment. But beyond that, after we felt that moment of dejection, we thought, wow, we've really got to keep moving on, and we've really got to keep going. And it takes a tremendous amount of courage to keep going, even though you face obstacles, even though you risk failure. And that's what I wanted to communicate to women when I'm writing this book on challenges is, you know what you're doing is a mighty thing, and there are going to be challenges in your way, but you know what, because God is with you, and because God wants to use your life as a force for good, you can dare mighty things. You can dare this. These are, the challenges are real, the obstacles are there, and I've talked to, hundreds of women who've faced them, that you can dare it because God is with you. And that was really what I wanted to communicate to women, is that they don't have to be scared by the obstacles and the challenges.
Well, something that you're touching on and you spoke about in the book is that, and these are my words, not yours, but like when I, as a man, am in a leadership position, when I fail for myself and not for my entire gender. And so it seems like kind of what you're saying is there's an inflated sense of fear on the part of women because they're judged more harshly. Is that fair to say?
I think that could be it. I think that some women, not all women, I don't want to speak for every woman, but a lot of myself and a lot of the women that I've spoken with, it is very tempting to take failure really personally. And I think some women have been so muted in their daily lives that it can just be really tempting just to keep your head down and go with the status quo.
You going back to the dare mighty things. So what are some practical things that women can do? And maybe they're maybe it's someone who is in college and looking to go into ministry, or even younger than that. It's that little girl who's pastoring to her stuffed animals, or maybe someone who is middle aged or in their second act in life. But what are some practical things that they can do to dare mighty things, so to speak?
Well, the first thing they need to do is have a rock solid understanding of their calling. Rock solid, no questions asked, and be very, very confident in their giftedness and what God has asked them to do. And if they don't have that, they're not going to be able to meet and greet the challenges that are going to come their way. They're not going to be able to do the training and the education that it needs to pursue a pastoral role if they don't have a rock-solid understanding of their calling, or to get the leadership experience that they need if they want to rise in the ranks of a nonprofit ministry, or make the decision to the woman who's serving in a nonprofit Christian ministry. One woman came to me and she said, I work for this ministry. It's a really well-known ministry, and she said, they've honored me. I've risen to a position in middle management, and she said, and I appreciate that, but I feel like I'm never going to grow as a leader here, and I feel like God is really calling me to basically to dare mighty things, to step out even more and grow even more as a leader. And she said, what do I do? And so I told her, I said, you have this calling, you understand your calling, you're so confident of it, you have a decision. Is God calling you to stay and work within that organization to bring about change, or is He charging you to go somewhere else? And unfortunately, I think that she decided that she was going to go somewhere else, so she went to get further education and further training. So the very first thing is to get a rock-solid understanding of your calling, and to know that you have a calling. I think a lot of women don't even know that they have a calling. And the second thing is to find some role models and some mentors, even if they have to be the literary kind, where you're looking up to someone that in the past that's not alive anymore, that left a path for you to follow, like Corrie ten Boom or the woman who went to China to build and led children through the war. Gladys Howard is her name. Find a role model and a mentor. And the third thing is to put a community of people that surround you, that support you in your endeavor. Be it your husband, be it, your peers at work or at school or your fellow churchgoers. Find a community to support you, and then just prayerfully go about pursuing your calling and asking God to open the right doors when those doors come up.
One of the things that I appreciated so much about the book is so often within Christianity, we do this weird thing where we kind of copy some kind of paradigm or something in the secular world and then just kind of throw some Jesus-y stuff on top of it.
Right.
But that's this book is the farthest thing from that. It's not, it's not lean on plus Jesus. It is just completely different. And to that point, in one of the last chapters called Live Well, Love Well, Lead Well, you talk about the importance of piety and love and spiritual growth in a leader. You tell a really sad story about a pastor with just complete lack of integrity in the seminary world. But why is that chapter important?
Well, I wrote this book not just for women leaders, but because I really wanted to write a good leadership book. And because whenever I went to look at leadership books and I read them in my doctorate program, I felt like they didn't have a lot of depth. And if you go to the secular bookstore like Barnes and Noble and you look at the secular books on leadership, what you see from the 1990s and the early 2000s maybe, you see a lot of really generic pop psychology, very superficial business leadership techniques. And I feel like that's been replicated a lot in the church. I feel like that we haven't talked a lot about character in leadership and the importance of that. And we're suffering the consequences of that because we don't care in our seminaries what kind of character our students have. We may have a check-in once in a while, but we really don't emphasize that. And as long as they're able to go through the coursework and do their Hebrew and Greek, we're able to give them an MDiv, and that's the end of it. And I don't think that that's where we need to stop. And what the funny thing is if you go now and you look at the current books on leadership in the secular world, what you'll find is books that advocate this character component, because we're starting to realize, the secular, all the culture at large, we are starting to realize our leaders really need to be persons of integrity. After the 2000, this movement towards what's called authentic leadership really started after September 11th, 2001, and then through the Bernie Madoff Ponzi schemes and all of the shady leadership that we've seen in the last few years has really caused people to yearn for leadership that really is grounded in solid character. And so what I'm trying to argue for is the importance of virtue in leadership, and it's not specifically applicable to women in any way. But I think if I'm writing a book on leadership, I'm writing a book for women too, for showing women, hey, it's important that you demonstrate these virtues.
This is kind of a slight aside, but one of the most fascinating things that I read in the book is that somewhere after World War II, and I think you may have been quoting some Barna research here, I'm not sure, but it seems like somewhere after World War II, the emphasis became less on the leadership's character and more on their ability. That's kind of my translation of the words you used as I remember them. But why do you think that is? What was taking place in the zeitgeist that changed that focus?
I think that there's a lot of things that started to change that. We used to believe in the very beginning in the great man theory that there are certain leaders that really inspire greatness, that are inherently leaders. And then we started saying, no, it's about skills, no, it's about this, it's about our coaches, or, what is good leadership. And it's just really us wrestling through those different issues. And it could be a variety of factors. It could be the growing emphasis on followers rather than leaders, and leaders adopting to their followers. I mean, there's a lot of complex factors that probably led to that. And, a growing, and all of that ended up with transformational leadership until finally we have today the authentic leader is what we want.
I hope that this book becomes required reading in the seminaries for both women and men. At the same time, it's accessible for the person who's not in seminary, and for, just for the person who's teaching Sunday school at their local church. The information that you have in here is invaluable. What else would you want to leave with the listeners today?
What I want to leave for the listeners goes back to the whole concept of the Teddy Roosevelt, the Dare Mighty Things. And, I, as a writer for Christianity Today, one of the parts of those jobs, one of the part of that job is staying on top of the news and what's going on in the world. And God's people are so needed right now. So needed in so many different areas, and we need everyone to use the giftedness that God's given them, and we need organizations to use the giftedness of the people that God's entrusted with them. So if there are people in churches that are sitting out on the pews that have this reservoir of giftedness, the church is obligated to use that and to see that that's utilized effectively in the work of the kingdom. And we, as people of God, have a responsibility to understand our calling, understand our giftedness, and to keep moving forward through whatever obstacles come our way. Because it's really tempting sometimes when we meet obstacles to say that that's not God's purpose, that must not be God's plan. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we have to move forward. We have to keep daring to do these mighty things. And that's part of our journey as Christians. And just because we come up against an obstacle like the Red Sea doesn't mean that we made a mistake getting out of Egypt. It means, wait, you keep going and with faith, and God's going to part that Red Sea because He's still the same God throughout all time. And what He can do for the Israelites, He can do in your life too. All you have to do is be willing to be faithful to Him and use what He's gifted you to do mighty things.
Hey, Halee, thanks so much for being on Seminary Dropout today.
Thank you, Shane, for having me.
That was Halee Gray Scott talking about her book, Dare Mighty Things. You can find her at hgscott.com. That's hgscott.com. You can find a link to her book on the show notes for this show and her Twitter page. Remember that this show is listener supported, and there are two main ways that you can support the show. First is by donating by going to shaneblackshear.com/support. Enter a one-time gift that you're comfortable with, or support on a monthly basis. You can also buy a t-shirt, a Seminary Dropout t-shirt. They're handsome and they're comfortable. Email me for details on that at shane@shaneblackshear.com. Yes, that is my real email address. The second way that you can support the show is by going to iTunes and give us a rating or a review. I want to thank our latest raters and reviewers. Matthew R. Stevens, 88. Thank you for that lovely review. E.P. Keaton, thank you for the review titled Way Beyond, quote-unquote, Fluffy. Also, Nietzsche's Downfall, clever name. Thank you for the review and the rating on iTunes. Remember, the ratings and the reviews on iTunes help the show become more visible. If you want to follow me on Twitter, remember my Twitter handle is beardonabike, just how it sounds. You can also follow me on Facebook, facebook.com/ShaneBlackshear123. And there's a new way. You can sign up for my mailing list. Go to ShaneBlackshear.com, go to the right-hand side, and look in the field for the email list, and put your email, and that's pretty much it. Okay, thanks for listening as always. I appreciate everyone who takes their time to listen, and I'll see you next time. Have a great week.